tell us a bit about yourself. What's your name? You don't mind, tell us how old you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Anderson Todd. So my first name is Anderson, like Anderson Cooper or Anderson Silva. Last name Todd. I'm 43, surprisingly. So I was born in 1978, and I'm an assistant professor in the teaching stream at the University of Toronto, and I'm also a private practice psychotherapist and consultant. I live in Toronto, so I've lived in Toronto. I lived internationally for a number of years. I lived in India for a while. I lived in England for a while, but I've lived in Toronto for quite a few years.
Where did you grow up? Was it in the UK or was it here?
No, I grew up in Ontario. So I originally lived in a small town. I'm not from there. I'm from Hamilton, actually, but I grew up most of my life in a small town called Owen Sound, which is up on the peninsula. It's about 2 hours north of Toronto.
Why don't you tell us a bit about what you do for a living?
Sure. So I wear, I guess, a few different hats. So as I said, I'm an assistant prof at U of T. So in that capacity, I originally taught in the cognitive science department. And now I teach interdisciplinary courses in Jungian Theory, and I also teach in the Buddhist Psychology and Mental Health program. So in addition to that, I do research. I'm the one of the founders and the assistant director of the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory at U of T. So I wear a few different hats there, obviously, teaching and research. In addition to that, I'm, as I said, a private practice psychotherapist, so I consult with clients locally and internationally. And do quite a bit of work around, common psychotherapy issues, but I also specialize in sort of life stage issues and spiritual emergency and a few things like that. I have a strong kind of Jungian orientation, although I'm not an analyst. I'm a psychotherapist, but nevertheless, I do a lot of work in that area. And then on top of that, I'm a writer and I do consulting. I consult with private schools, so I do enrichment education consulting, and I've consulted with organizations, not-for-profits and corporations on a number of different projects.
So, so I was struck by something you said just now. What's a spiritual emergency? I've never heard of that before.
So a spiritual emergency, so it's not uncommon. I mean, it's not something everybody experiences, obviously, but it's not uncommon for people to have certain kinds of experiences, especially if they're involved in something like meditation, or if they're just sort of deeply spiritually interested, right? To start having uncommon experiences. And previously in our culture, we might have had specific people to go talk to about this, but for most people, when they start experiencing unusual sort of altered states and things, they really don't know what to make of it. And these days, mostly it's the case that when they start experiencing these kinds of things, they get referred to a therapist. Unfortunately, most therapists also don't really have a clear sense of what to do with this kind of material. And very often, if they were referred to a psychiatrist, they would get categorized as, having a psychosis or something. The way that I work with these things, there are obviously cases that are sort of biologically driven and require conventional psychiatric treatment. But in many cases, what people are dealing with is existential or mystical material. And I actually think that in dealing with those things, there is sort of a rich human tradition across most cultures to address that. So people are sometimes experiencing visionary material or mystical material, right? They're having unusual altered states in terms of their sense of self and identity and the world. And so one of the things that I specialize in is sort of guiding people through those kinds of experiences.
What do you think the world and its ecosystem will look like in the coming decades?
Right. So I think it's becoming increasingly clear to everybody that in an ecological sense, we're in a very deep state of global crisis. There are sort of a number of intersecting crises, in fact, that are sort of afflicting us globally at this point. So there's an energy crisis, there's an economic crisis, there are various political crises. We have what my colleague John Vervaeke refers to, I think quite poignantly, as a meaning crisis, which is a deep problem. But on top of that, we also have large, intractable ecological crises. So we're dealing with, of course, global warming, which people are generally familiar with, but on top of that, we're dealing with sort of biodiversity collapse of various kinds, species loss, certain kinds of, as they call them, forever chemicals and plastic contamination. So there are sort of a number of intersecting factors which seem to be accelerating and beginning to generate feedback loops, positive feedback loops that are making this more dangerous. Where we're likely to be in the near future, that's always a difficult prediction to make, even with sophisticated models in science. But my sense is that if we can't, in some sense, change course relatively soon, we're probably looking at the imminent collapse of our civilization. And indeed, if we don't change course somewhat radically, we may in fact be looking at the imminent collapse of sort of the human species and life as we know it. And in a much shorter period of time than most people are generally considering. So many of the projections, including the more conservative IPCC projections, have often tagged kind of the state of global warming to, a number of degrees Celsius increase, averaged up to the year 2100. But in recent years, it's become clear that many of these factors are accelerating quite dramatically. So we're seeing methane outventing, right, in places where the permafrost is melting. We seem to be approaching sort of a complete melt of Arctic ice, the so-called blue ocean event. We're looking at disruptions of the sort of ocean currents and air currents that moderate temperature across much of the northern hemisphere. And of course, we're seeing an outbreak of wildfires, floods, droughts, etc., and the various kinds of species disruptions that accompany those things. So my sense is that on our present course, within 25 years, we are probably looking at a radical change in our way of life, and quite likely the sort of imminent collapse of what we recognize as our current business as usual civilization.
I think you alluded to this slightly before, but it's not simply only the ecosystem collapsing, right? There's also other factors contributing to this collapse that seems to be imminent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously the collapse of the ecosystem, the sort of foremost thing that grabs everybody's attention, of course, is climate change, as caused by global warming and greenhouse gases. But that's intimately tied together with things like our economic system, which is a system of, infinite growth in a finite system. So it's a kind of economic mirage that's impossible. But also it's very specifically tied to the economy of fossil fuels, which has enabled the kind of mass farming that we have, the kind of automation that we have. And that in and of itself is a collapsing system. So one only needs to look at, for instance, the difference in energy return over energy invested between early oil wells in the 1860s. So you can imagine an oil well in Pennsylvania in 1860. They swung a pickaxe and a giant spray of oil shot out of the ground. Well, now in Canada, we're digging up oil sands, tar sands. They're not, in fact, oil, they're tar sands. And the only reason we're doing that is that we've already picked all the low-hanging fruit. So that stuff we've known about for a long time, but it hasn't even been remotely economical until recently because we need it. Our conventional sources are depleting. And to give you an idea of this sort of ratio of energy return over energy invested, that original Pennsylvania oil well, which shot oil, out in a big geyser, right, had an energy return over energy invested of about 100 to 1, meaning that, for every 1 unit of energy you put in to get the oil, you got 100 units of energy out. Well, the energy return over energy invested of tar sands is about 1 to 1.5. 1.5 to 1, properly speaking. Meaning that, really, it's not economical at all. And a collapse of the fossil fuel system will also be just an absolutely devastating blow to the world economy, and one that isn't sort of going to be fixable by switching over to electric vehicles. Electricity is a transmission method for energy, not a method of generation. So, that is sort of an encroaching factor. We are, of course, seeing biodiversity collapse, which is deeply problematic. So there are places in Europe where we've seen a 90% drop in insect populations. And I have sometimes referred to this as the bug storm elegy. When I was a kid, we used to travel quite widely by motorcycle through the United States. And, any place that you went to, you would get, you would hit storms of insects, right? Sort of splattering on your windshield. People are increasingly reporting that just isn't the case. There are far fewer insects. And so I noticed in my home area, there don't seem to be fireflies to the same extent. I haven't seen a praying mantis in quite some time. So these are the kinds of collapses that we see. And there are lots of small instances of this. Honeybee populations being threatened, and that seems to be a pesticide and parasite problem. But the point is, all of these things are kind of intersecting all at once, and they tend to feed off of each other in various ways. Arguably, at the root of all of this is this concept of the meaning crisis, which is to say that the way that we're interacting with the world as human beings and the way that we think of ourselves is deeply fundamentally broken for us. And we keep attempting to solve problems in sort of the nature of our being, existential questions in being, by sort of buying more stuff, right? Stronger economic activity. But that, of course, is hastening this whole problem. It's accelerating this whole problem. So we need a really substantial shift. As I've sometimes said, I was a child of the Cold War, and so I grew up with nuclear weaponry hovering over my head, right? The idea that, a nuclear firestorm could wipe us out of existence in 5 minutes if somebody pushed the button. But the answer to that problem fundamentally was just to do nothing, right? Just to not push the button. And we face a very different problem with our current set of apocalypses, which is that we have to change absolutely everything. And the question remains whether or not 8 billion humans are capable of changing their entire way of life in a quick enough hairpin turn to keep us from disaster.
How do you feel our chances are that 8 billion people will change their way of life before it's too late?
I think the chances are very low. I don't think that human beings don't deal very well with slow changes. We react relatively well to easily identifiable fast changes. So mobilizing for a war is something that we can see a population doing relatively quickly. But slow changes and changes that affect every aspect of our lives, we don't tend to adapt to those things. And we can see that there's pretty widespread denial. But even more importantly than that, even for people that acknowledge these problems, it's often the case that we aren't changing our way of life in any significant way. We're still continuing to consume. We're still continuing to use energy. The small changes that we're making, a little bit of recycling, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, it's really not sufficient to address the problem. And I suspect that we aren't going to change fast enough. And indeed that, given the amount of greenhouse gas that we've already released, the changes that we've already created, we're on track for a disaster of an unprecedented scale, something that we've just basically never seen in human history. So I don't think that we are going to change fast enough, unfortunately. I suspect that at this point, the task is going to be more a question of how much of the human species and life otherwise on the planet we can preserve, and to what extent we can preserve some of the hard-won lessons of our civilization, to what extent we can preserve science and some amount of wisdom in the face of this coming very, very nasty period.
I'd like to move to more personal territory now. Let's start with what growing up was like, what your childhood was like growing up in the Cold War.
Yeah, so, I was born in 1978, so when I was a kid, the tensions between the Soviet Union and the U.S. were, once again kind of reaching a high in the Reagan administration. And I grew up very, very aware of the threat of nuclear war. I was a bit precocious, I think, and as a kid, among other things, like when I was 7, I built a small scale model of an atom bomb to show how it worked, and I became very interested in projections of radioactive fallout and what it would be like if the bomb launched. And this, aside from my intellectual curiosity, led to a great number of nightmares. So I grew up with that sort of very much on the brain. And that, in some ways, obviously sort of faded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not, of course, that nuclear weapons have gone away. They haven't. But as I grew a little bit older, it became clear to me that there were other sort of slower, more pressing problems which threatened all of us, and among them, certainly climate change. So I grew up with a strong awareness of this kind of material, and when I was about 12, I had, something of a break. I sort of realized for the first time in a serious way that there were no adults at the wheel. which is to say that most of the things that I had been told, it seemed to me, about the way that life worked or how to be happy, how to have a good life, just weren't reflected in what I saw in the behavior of the adults around me. And this was a really jarring and eye-opening idea, because it shifted me from this notion that I should follow a certain kind of track, check off the things in order to get someplace, right? And suddenly opened my eyes to the idea that actually, it didn't seem like anybody knew what was going on. It seemed like everybody, including the leaders, were just stumbling ahead at high speed, right? Making it up as they went. So that was a really formative thing for me. It influenced a lot of what I've done in terms of my career and in terms of my approach to life, generally speaking. And I think that actually is an awareness that more people are coming to. COVID has certainly, I think, accelerated this, that people have this sense that, the story that they've been told about what they need to do, right? Check, 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 and you get a good life, is just simply not true. And for many of the younger generations, that specific promise having been broken is really striking them. People have less confidence in education, less confidence in the economy, less confidence in the environment. So yeah, I guess growing up, I was a skeptical young person, is maybe what I would say. And as an adult, that skepticism hasn't really gone away. It's just been sort of tempered by alternate ways of thinking and, to some extent, the professional commitment to try to help people as they're navigating this sort of thing.
So earlier you mentioned at some point you had a break where you realized that the adults didn't really know what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So can you narrow this down? Was this a specific event, or was it sort of a gradual shift over a couple of months or something like that?
I think it was a gradual shift. There were a few things that kind of came together. So one was, I suffer historically from depression and anxiety, and that's to some extent inherited. My father also had depression, so I was experiencing depression with sort of increasing frequency. That was part of it. Part of it was just that, the behaviors that I was seeing in various adults just didn't seem to match up in some sense with the, instruction, with the lessons, with the guidelines, the rules that I was being given. So I think it was kind of gradual, and it really started when I was 12. It would have hit a serious break when I was 15. And by the time I was 16, I, essentially speaking, dropped out of school. So I had a pretty rough and tumble 16th year. I, in fact, am not a high school graduate, so it's a rare case. Although I'm a professor at a university, I am not a high school graduate, which I think surprises people pretty often. But, that started when I was 12, and, recognizing, getting the sense that it just didn't line up. And I was watching, one of the things certainly was sort of environmental chaos. I was like, well, if people know what's going on, why is this happening, right? Or if people have some idea of, how they should be conducting their lives, why are they so unhappy? Why are addiction rates so high? Why is crime so high? Why is drug use so high, right? So, that was kind of a convergent thing. By the time I was 15, it had really begun to settle in that I felt like the entire system was nonsense at some level. Now, since I teach at a university, I've obviously modulated my opinion towards that to some extent, but only to some extent. I think that for a large number of the, people who are sort of going along with the rules and with the system as it's laid out, there are a lot of implicit promises that are sort of broken inherently. They're sort of told to do things in a certain way and everything is going to be fine. But that, in fact, is not my experience. And it was eye-opening, I think, because I began to see that I had a recognition, I guess, that the entire value system of our culture struck me as being very off base, sort of not producing human happiness, not producing human fulfillment. So it was slow, I suppose, but it became dramatically obvious to me or something first around 12. I was like, wait a second, and thereafter, it just was sort of adding more examples to that until I finally sort of said, that's it. I'm out.
So what do you do after you were out?
I had a very unusual career track. So I did continue to go to school for a while, although I didn't graduate. When I left school, I had started a business. So I had invented something in high school, which got kind of a strong response. And I was in touch with a university professor up at Laurentian, Michael Persinger, who was very supportive of my work at the time. So I went into business with a friend of mine. We had a business for a while. We moved to Toronto, and I picked up a job doing writing and sort of digital design stuff for an interactive media company in Toronto. It was sort of a startup. So I did that for a few years. Then I worked in systems design for a few years. Then I worked in advertising briefly. And then all of that kind of came to a head. I was still finding it quite unsatisfying. And essentially speaking, I sort of dropped out of society for a number of years. So I didn't have an apartment. I was, in fact, I guess by any conventional definition, I was homeless. So sometimes I, slept in the rough. Sometimes I traveled. Sometimes I stayed with people. But I didn't maintain my own place for 5 years. During that period, I was working as a professional writer. And I eventually spent 2.5 years writing novels, which I did for a while. And then finally, I sort of decided that it was time to leave the cave and come back to civilization. And that was around the period that I decided that I would train as a psychotherapist. And so I ended up coming back to Toronto and pursuing that, which in turn led to all sorts of things like my professorship and some of my other professional aspects. So it was kind of a twisty road.
In one of our previous interviews, you mentioned that you were doing financial data analysis for a while, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things I did. I worked for insurance for a while too, and I did a bit of software design for a while. I did a lot of different things. But yeah, the financial analysis piece, so I was doing sort of data mining and analysis for a company. At the time, they were looking at doing Sharia banking, so Sharia investing, which is a whole separate interesting issue. But as a consequence of that, I was reading lots and lots and lots of insider financial news. And in the course of reading this stuff, I read thousands and thousands of pages of this insider financial stuff, and it began to become gradually apparent to me that the conversation on that side was clearly indicating certain kinds of instabilities in the market. So I reached out to everybody that I knew and sort of said, "Hey, I think the market's about to crash. You should really do stuff." And nobody listened to me because I don't have any investment background. And then, of course, the market did crash. So that would have been whenever that was, 2007.
2008.
I was doing that for 2007, 2008. Yeah, I would have had the job, I think, in 2007. So yeah, and that was interesting. I actually was firing my business back up again at that point. So that crashed us because we lost our investors. We were supposed to move to Bali. And as a consequence, I ended up moving to India for a year. So as I said, twisty road.
This is when you spent a couple of years basically homeless, right?
Well, this would have been after that, actually. So I was effectively homeless from 21 through to maybe 26.
I'm just trying to situate the time periods here. So
sure.
So you left high school at 15, right?
No, 15 was when I had my break. Okay, so 15, I started thinking that things were kind of screwed up. 16, I basically stopped going to classes. 17, I built my invention. And then from kind of 17 through to 21, I had that business. I moved to Toronto at 19. I did a bunch of different jobs, including marketing and running my business and digital media and whatever, until about 21. And then at 21, I said, forget it, I'm out. And that was 21 through to 26. So I basically just sort of, I wandered, I did writing, etc. Then I was stable in a house for about 2.5 years where I wrote full time. So I wrote 16 hours a day. And then at the tail end of that, I had a set of experiences that sort of told me, okay, it's time to leave the cave. And I would have come back to Toronto, I think, at late 28 or maybe early 29. I did a year here. Then the financial crash happened. I went to India when I was 30. I spent a year there. I came back at 31. And that's when I sort of did my degree work and training and started to sort of move into some of the stuff that I do now. So research. In the few years after that, research, teaching at the university, and then once I was accredited, working as a psychotherapist.
We talked about this last time as well, where you started getting a little bit into peak oil, limits of growth. When was this?
So peak oil had been on my radar in some ways for a long time, but when I was doing this sort of research for the investment company, I started reading a lot more of that stuff. It was very, it was very on the rise, and it was right before a huge spike in oil prices. And where I had sort of known about it prior to that, that was when I did my deep dive into it and became intensely and immediately concerned about the problem. Once I got familiar with the arguments, I realized there really wasn't much to say against it, unless you wanted to sort of go against basic laws of physics and thermodynamics. So that would have been probably around 2006, 2007. I started really getting into that. And certainly it's something that I still pay a fair bit of attention to. The limits to growth, likewise. I mean, I've been familiar with that model for a long time, but I became very interested in it around that period, 2006, 2007, 2008.
So how old were you at that time?
So in 2008, I would have been 30. So my late 20s, I would say, was when I became intensely interested in this. But I had known about it for a long time. I've sort of followed various collapse models for many years.
So does that coincide with kind of that time when you withdrew from society a bit, if I'm remembering correctly?
I would say it was after that to a great extent. Although when I withdrew from society, when I withdrew from society, that was clearly part of it. I had a sense that our society was on the wrong track, and I certainly had a sense of environmental collapse and so on and so forth. Just the peak oil component of it didn't become as clear to me until later in that process. So, I was aware of it, but I wasn't as aware of the economics of the situation and, some of the stronger arguments in that favor. But I've essentially always had an interest in this. I mean, if you were to go back and talk to people that I knew in my late teens, they would tell you that I've always been talking doom at some level or another. So this is an ongoing concern, although I'm often also identified as an optimist. So many of the people that I know, I talk about this to, and they're like, but you're an optimist. I prefer to think of myself as not as optimistic, but as hopeful, which is an important distinction.
You want to talk about this distinction now?
Sure. The distinction, as I make it, and a few other people have pointed to this distinction in places, this is a distinction that you saw. There's an interesting anecdote about prisoners of war during the American Vietnam War, and who sort of survived those situations psychologically and who didn't. And the difference was that the optimists were the people who were saying, don't worry, we're going to be out by Christmas. We're going to be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And they would say, we're going to be out by Easter. We're going to be out by... And over and over again, their sort of, somewhat unfounded projection would get crushed. And that would eventually crush them. That's optimism. Hope, on the other hand, is an acknowledgement that things are, in fact, bad, but that you have ways of responding to it. So hope is about recognizing your own inner resources in responding to something. And humans are capable of responding to very dire circumstances, right? When you look at war zones or natural disaster zones, right? People think that those are going to be, outbreaks of complete anarchy where everybody is, preying on each other, like an apocalypse movie. And that's not actually true. What you actually see is people banding together. You see mutual aid. People often report it as being, among the most meaningful period of their lives. So that is hope. The idea that in fact our, capacities are greater than we know, and that there are things that we can do to respond to this without pretending like it isn't happening.
I think that's a very very important aspect of coping with things in a healthy way.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
it's an indispensable method of coping with things in a healthy way.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've said quite a bit recently in various interviews is it's interesting to look at people's response to COVID, to the pandemic, and to the lockdowns, because people tend to sort of break into three categories very quickly. There's the people who essentially are optimistic. They're like, everything is going back to normal really soon. Don't worry, everything's going to be back to normal in 2 months. And they keep kind of pushing back on this, but gradually as it becomes clearer and clearer that this was not part of the plan, that nobody is in charge of this, right? That this is not This isn't how things are supposed to be working, right? That's getting worn down. But then you see two other groups. The one group is sort of moves, I think, to the position that I've moved to, which is, oh, nobody's in charge. Like, there are no grown-ups in the room. There is no master plan, right? It's not, this isn't being sort of orchestrated. But then another group decides that actually, indeed, there is a plan. And so therefore, because it's bad, the plan is by bad people, right? It becomes conspiracy thinking. And that kind of situation turns up pretty much across the board with all of these situations, with wildfires, with whatever. There are some people who are clinging to the idea that everything is going to go back to the way it was, right? But that is getting harder and harder and harder to sort of maintain. And so consequently, you're getting people who move one of the other two ways. And the problem with the nobody is in charge is that it can lead to despair. Despair and resignation. So unless you can transition that through into hope, right? And that's a little bit about sort of the, the stages of grieving in a sense, right? You go through a variety of reactions to this material, and then eventually you have to settle on, okay, what can I do about it? Like, what can I actually do here? Because much of it is out of our individual control, and much of it is not something I suspect that we're going to be able to turn aside. It's something that we need to respond to, not pretend it isn't happening. So yes, I would tend to think that hope is basically indispensable, provided that you distinguish it from optimism, which is just like everything is going to be fine. And I suspect everything is not going to be fine.
It's interesting you bring up the stages of grief here. So I was wondering if tell me if I'm going down the wrong track here, but like, is there a way that like, could you map the stages of grief to, say, like, your own life? Because to me, it seems like there's a kind of progression where you were kind of like in conflict with like the things that you were realizing, and then sort of like in your late 30s, in your 30s, you kind of made this more definite push towards like addressing it in a more direct fashion.
Yeah, I mean, the stages of grief aren't, they're not as linear as people sometimes think of them. It's not like you just go through, right? There's a lot of back and forth involved. But yes, I think that there is a quality to that. I mean, for a long time, my answer to the problems that I saw in civilization was to say that I didn't want to play, right? It's like, this is a dumb game and I don't want to play it. The recognition that I came to later was that, in a sense, I owe it to other human beings to be involved in a way that is helpful. And so, yes, in some ways, I think it does map. There is a sense of hope, right? And when one is involved in something like psychotherapy, right, one has to have a position of hope because, most of the time you can't just reach in and fix somebody's problem, right? You can walk with them, you can help them, you can advise them, you can give them techniques and things. But, it's not the kind of thing, it's not like fixing a car engine. You can't just sort of reach in and it's like, oh, here's the problem, stick in a new part. So I think that general approach to things has deeply informed my approach to civilization at large. And so much of the work that I do now, particularly around sort of lecturing with the university and some of my work online, so I've done sort of YouTube work, et cetera, where I'm reaching out to people with lectures. A lot of that has to do with this sort of specific idea. It's like, well, what can I do here? And one of the things, of course, that I can do is that I can reach people. I can talk to them about it, and I can let them know how to work with themselves, how to deal with their own emotional difficulties, and how to come to sort of a new way of being and a new way of looking at things. So I see that very much as being, my contribution. A lot of my work revolves around the concept of intentional self-transformation. And that kind of intentional self-transformation, I think, is what's required. No matter how this goes down, we are going to have to figure out new ways to operate in the world. And, whether that's, 8 billion people or 4 billion people or 1 billion people or, 1,000 people, really doesn't matter. It's still, it does matter, but it's still a worthwhile task, right? So I just try to apply my efforts, where I can and try to reach sort of as many people with what I think is a useful approach to those things. And it does completely grow out of my own experiences.
I do want to circle back to some of that stuff later, but especially about the meaning crisis, intentional self-transformation and such. But right now I was curious about the time that you withdrew from society. I'm wondering if you would tell me a bit more about it. But I understand it kind of sounds like it was a difficult time for you. So if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay as well.
No, it's fine. I mean, in some ways it was a difficult time, but to be honest, one of the things that was somewhat surprising about it was that in many ways it wasn't a difficult time. So, making the decision that I was going to quit my job and give up my apartment and wander the earth, solving mysteries, which was basically what I did, that was a little bit jarring. I did it for some reasons, for spiritual reasons. Like I was sort of concerned with pushing away the materialistic aspects of society. I was like, I'm not doing this. I don't think it's a good use of time. But one of the things actually that ended up being somewhat surprising to me was that, first off, my happiness didn't seem to be significantly worse off than it had been, right? You might think that not knowing where you're going to sleep or what you're going to eat or how you're going to get money would, really like knock you down. And granted, I was in a somewhat privileged position, right? Because I did have friends who were working and I could stay with them sometimes and so on and so forth. But my situation was pretty precarious. Nevertheless, I found that my days were as rich or richer in some ways. There was something to be said, actually, for that time period. I didn't starve. On top of that, yes, of course, it came with its own difficulties, but regular life also comes with its difficulties. And one of the things that was a lasting transformation for me was that I realized that I could cope, right? That I could figure problems out. So, when I was in England the first time, I had basically no money. And I went out into the countryside and, nightfall came. And so I needed to find some place to sleep. Right? And so I slept in, a collapsed barn or something. And that was not great. And then the next day I forget where I slept. But by the third day, right, I had begun to figure out how to do this. I'd begun to solve this problem. It's like I would, nightfall would come and I'd be like, okay, where am I going to sleep? I slept in a ruined castle. I slept in an abandoned vegetable cannery. I slept in a World War II era concrete bunker on the private grounds of a manor. I slept in all these interesting places, right? Because, if you're homeless, what's the difference? And the thing that really, got to me after a while was like, oh, you can just figure this problem out. It's just a problem and you can figure it out. And once I had done so, I realized that although I'm in no hurry to be poor again, I enjoy having certain things. I'm addicted to books, so I have like a 5,000 volume library at home. I'm not in any hurry to give up my lifestyle in some ways. But if my lifestyle took a sharp hit, I also know I would be fine because I was fine. So, in that sense, the two things tied in pretty closely. I spent lots of time with people. I spent lots of time reading. I spent lots of time in nature. I spent lots of time talking to people about their problems. It was in some ways a much simpler life, but it was not, frankly, as bad, I think, as what people imagine when they picture this sort of thing. I think people imagine, a horrible situation. And obviously, right, my circumstances were such that I had a certain amount of backup support, and many unhoused people don't have those advantages. They have nobody else to lean on at all, and, they don't have good resources, and they may be suffering from serious mental illness, so that's a problem. But in my case, it was sort of a great simplification. And frankly, that simplification in some ways is something that I still sometimes think fondly about. It's not uncommon with my current very busy professional schedule to think, oh, I would love to just fill a backpack and like wander someplace. So, I do actually think that has bearing on these questions that we're discussing, because one of the things that we're deeply afraid of, one of the things that keeps us from simplifying our civilization in some ways, is this belief that if our standard of living drops, it'll be horrible and unbelievably horrible for that to happen. But that hasn't been my experience at all. I think that many people in other countries have lower standards of living, and they're actually happier, frankly, than people are in North America. And my experience was that I was not significantly, worse off in any way, which was surprising, but it made a lasting impression on me.
So was there a singular point in your life where you sort of had this realization that we are bound for collapse?
I mean, there have been sort of a bunch of these moments. For a long time, I would see bits of news here and there, and those would be deeply worrying. And I would see, actual things in the world that would be worrying. So there's like a breed of salamander that is in my hometown that I stopped seeing at some point. You used to find them under rocks. I just stopped seeing them. And I thought, uh-oh, like that can't be good. So there were some things like that. And then there was seeing footage of things like, Greenland melting, rivers of water pouring off Greenland. I happened to watch that footage, ironically, while I was on vacation in Hawaii. And, I had to kind of keep it to myself. My family could see me watching this footage, and they were like, what's wrong? And I didn't want to tell them, because who wants to ruin the family vacation by saying, oh, it's just the world is ending. Anyway, let's have lunch. So, there were sort of things that added up like that. And the moment when it really struck me, it might have been Greenland, actually. I think it actually might have been that Greenland period. There had been a bunch of things where I was worried about it, and I had done some writing about sort of competing exponential curves. So the idea that, there were certain things that we were doing to try to address the problem, and there are, I add, some social and technological solutions I think that we could theoretically address the problem with. So I keep close track of fusion, I keep close track of nanotech, I keep close track of genetic engineering, and I keep close track of AI research, which, because of cognitive science, is in my background. And, those things hypothetically could help us, and so could the study of wisdom, which is one of the areas of my own research. And so I did lots of tracking of this idea that these exponential curves were competing against other kinds of collapse curves, in a sense. But sometime around watching the Greenland footage, it suddenly dawned on me. I was like, we're not changing fast enough. We're not taking this seriously enough. And it's not that we're completely out of time. Like, it's important to note that there's a big difference, so that the idea that things are going to get worse doesn't mean we should all just engage our bucket list and say, forget it, and go do whatever we want. And, that's a bad idea, right? There are degrees of problem. But what I realized, I think, for the first time, and that would have been, I suppose, 3 years ago? 2.5 years ago? What I realized for the first time then was, many of the effects of this are not a question anymore. They're already coming. And so, that was a real moment. And I think that moment for many other people has begun to hit, particularly this year, because of the wildfires and the hurricanes and the floods and the crop failures, and right. So there's enough sort of things happening that I think generally people are like, wait a minute, this isn't a in 15 years problem. It's a this is happening now problem. And for me, I knew enough about the long range science to realize what we were seeing now is really just the tip of the spear. And we've already released these greenhouse gases, and the various technologies that people are proposing to attempt to contain those things, they're not really feasible. Carbon capture, if you look at the science around that, it's a joke. It isn't going to make any significant difference. And so now, you see people starting to talk about global dimming. And the idea of global dimming to me is it's a very classic sort of human hubris kind of thing. It's like, oh no, things are getting too hot, we'll just darken the sky, as though that isn't going to cause its own massive problems. So yeah, I think we're in for a rough ride. And about 3 years ago, this maybe switched for me from being a question of, we really need to do something, this is bad, to, oh wait, this is already happening. And now the question is, will any of us survive? That is now the question. The question isn't, is it going to fall apart? It's going to fall apart. Our civilization is going to collapse. I would put good money on it. But the question of our civilization collapsing and the question of whether or not the human species and other species survive are two different questions. And it's the second question that we need to be asking. Our civilization is not going to make it. And frankly, I think that's fine. Most civilizations collapse. That's how it works. Civilizations rise and they fall. They have a life cycle like anything else. And our civilization, frankly, is the one that got us into this mess. So it's probably best if we don't continue it in its present form. It's not making people especially happy, and it's causing a huge number of problems, and not just for us. So, yeah, the question of, how many people are going to make it through, et cetera, is one of those questions, which is kind of a dark question, but nevertheless something that we need to confront at some level.
I was actually going to bring the conversation back to Greenland.
Sure.
Back to when you, so you identified like, watching Greenland's ice melt as sort of like one of the turning points where you kind of realize like this is probably not gonna get better, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had been watching a lot of things for a long time, but there was something so striking and vivid. If you saw any of that footage from that particular summer when Greenland was melting, and you read some of the numbers about, the incalculable number of tons of ice that were melting. There was, basically like lakes across the surface of what had been glaciers and rivers pouring off of this thing. Yeah, there was something about the scale of it. And I think some of that, is about having done a fair bit of reading about the last ice age and understanding the dynamics there, and worrying about the thermal regulation of ocean currents, which, if people aren't familiar, is like a sort of a saltwater, freshwater current that circulates warmth from the tropics up towards northern Europe. And what happened during the last ice age was, during the glacial breakdown in North America, there was at one point a dam break, right? That dam break carved the whole St. Lawrence, right? So the leftovers of what that lake is the Great Lakes now, but it carved the St. Lawrence. And when that fresh water slushed into the ocean, it disrupted this thing and, clamped down. In 10 years, we had sort of this ice age event. So it was sort of a dramatic visual, but part of it was that we've been talking about these things for a long time. And when you look at the numbers, as people are fond of saying, half of all greenhouse gases that human beings have been emitted since the first episode of Seinfeld. So it's not that this is sort of going back 100 years. We're not slowing down. We're speeding up, right? We've known about this for quite some time. We've been talking about it for a long time and saying, like, we need to do something. But it became very obvious to me in that moment that not only were we not doing anything to stop it, in fact, we had radically accelerated it. And that was when it was clear to me that, in a sense, the car was going so fast that even if we could convince people to slam on the brakes, it wasn't going to stop soon enough for us to not hit the brick wall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm saying this in a very matter of fact, and I'm smiling as I say it, right? But I should be very clear that I do not always feel this way. I go through, frankly, very deep periods, sometimes of depression, very deep periods of anxiety, and very deep periods of climate grief. And one of the changes in my approach to this stuff is that it used to sort of sneak up on me, right? I would just be reading news and it would come and then it would sort of pounce out of the bushes on top of me. And because I have this background in psychotherapy, I understand that you are always better off confronting something of your own free will, making a decision to confront something, than you are letting it pounce on you, letting it ambush you, right? When something ambushes you, you feel powerless. But if you make the decision to go and confront it, it's still going to be scary, right? But it's likely to not be as traumatic. And so one of the decisions I've made in the last 2 years is that I take time every now and then to look at it full on. I have a substantial library of books on this subject. The Uninhabitable Earth is a recent book that's quite excellent, right? 6 Degrees is likewise a terrifying book. There are lots of them. The updated Club of Rome report, right? The updated Limits to Growth. And every once in a while I do a deep dive. So I did one of these this past July of 2021. And I knew before I even did it that it was going to cause me to experience extreme distress, which indeed it did. I spent most of that month, which I take off every year, I spent most of that month dealing with tremendous grief and dealing with deep anxiety and fear. However, it's also necessary. It's honest. In many cases, I think when people are avoiding this material, they're doing so in a fashion which is a bit like when people have a strange symptom, but they refuse to go to the doctor to get it checked out, right? Because they don't want to know, right? Oh, I don't want to find out I have something. And to me, that has never made sense, because it's like, well, wouldn't you rather know early? Like, the earlier you know, the longer you have to deal with it. But that's not always how human psychology works. People often would rather not know. And I think that that's a situation. If you've ever sort of done a dive on this stuff and then tried to talk to somebody about it, you will rapidly find that people's ability to absorb this material is quite limited. And even people who were kind of close to me and who were receptive when I talked about this 10 or 15 years ago would often get to a place where they were like, you have to stop. Like, I can't hear any more of this. Like, it's ruining my day. And to which my way of thinking is like, okay, like, I have to be respectful of people's boundaries, but if you think it's ruining your day now, imagine how it's going to ruin your day in 20 years. So I should be clear. I'm being sort of matter of fact about this, but actually it's extremely difficult to deal with, and I acknowledge that. I have to do my own really significant processing around it, and I think probably in many ways my tool set is actually much better than most people's for processing this kind of material. So it's a hard thing.
I was thinking about how you are always seeking out knowledge and more writing and information about this topic, about climate change and how our civilization is weak to these shocks. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking, like, because it sounds a little bit like that's kind of what you were doing even when you were 7, when you were building the little atomic bomb.
Sure.
Would you agree with that, or was that? Or I'm wondering, like, when you were making the atomic bomb, was that you sort of making a conscious decision even at that age to confront the facts, even though it caused you pain, or was that more of a coping mechanism?
That's an interesting question. So a little of both. Sometimes it's become really clear to me over the years that in the past, many times when I became sort of, for a short period of time, whatever, I'm sort of obsessively interested in these subjects, it often coincided with some kind of existing anxiety. So I would be anxious about something unrelated to this. And it took me a long time to pick up one of the patterns, which is I would become intensely interested in this stuff when I was already anxious about other parts of my life. And I suspect that some of that is a bit of an escape mechanism, right? I can read about the end of the world because if the world ends, then I don't have to solve this other problem, right? I don't have to work out, some issue with my parents, or I don't have to work out some issue with my relationship, or I don't have to work out some issue with school or work, right? It doesn't matter. Everything is going to explode, so it's irrelevant, right? So sometimes it's a psychological mechanism, and I see some of that at the young age. I mean, as full disclosure, the other thing that happened when I was 7 was my parents got divorced. So I do see a link there, right? That in some ways, for me as a kid at 7, my world had already exploded. Everything that I was used to had already exploded. Now, I was aware of these things before that. My parents were very liberal in terms of the films that they allowed me to watch and the books they allowed me to read. So I sort of knew about this stuff anyway. I grew up on a diet of horror movies. And so, like, I'd seen Terminator at a really young age. So I saw Terminator. I loved Terminator when I was like 5. So, in some ways, that stuff was already on my radar. But the fact that I became so interested in it, I suspect coincided with the fact that psychologically speaking, like, my world had already exploded, and now I was trying to make sense of it. Now, that's a bit of a retroactive post hoc explanation. It's hard to say how closely those things are linked. But yeah, in a lot of ways, I have spent a great deal of my life, I think, confronting the fact that I think the stories we are told about the way the world works are mostly nonsense. And so consequently, right, the threats that are coming our way when people are sort of saying like, whatever, it's fine. It's fine. I'm sure somebody will invent something. Or I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure it doesn't matter. It's like, that, to me betrays a real lack of sense of sort of history and a sense of science. These are real issues. But they do, of course, tangle together with personal issues. And, the way that I've sort of separated those two things, right, separated them out, if you have the attitude, oh, well, the whole world is ending, so I guess I shouldn't bother doing anything, that is, I think, a mistake. It's paralyzing you. But it's definitely the case that, given that these things are happening, there are some things that maybe we shouldn't spend so much time caring about. And there are other things that we should spend time caring about, namely people, and figuring out how we're going to make that continue. Because everything except for people is just sideshow. People are what actually matters, And not just people, nature, broadly speaking. I'm extremely sympathetic to animals and nature, and I think we have to be cognizant of that. But everything else, social media, right? Lots of other things that are going on. Consumerist enterprises, most of that stuff is distraction. And I like entertainment and games and stuff as much as anybody. But I also recognize that business as usual is not working. And I've known that for a long time.
I guess going back to a bit to sort of like your coping mechanisms, and because this is new to me that this is really interesting to me that sort of like you learning about apocalypse and like data relating to collapse. This was like sort of your escape from like your other anxieties. But now that collapse itself is one of your main sources of anxiety, like what's your escape now? Or do you even try to escape? Or are you just against the wall now?
What's my escape now?
Yeah.
The answer is now I try not to escape. Because escape is an illusion, right? Now, does that mean that I'm thinking about this all the time? No, of course not. I like to spend time with my friends and my family and my spouse, right? So, there are lots of things that I do that aren't related to this. I spend, I think, probably a higher percentage of my time involved in. So I'm a role player, and I have been since I was really young. I've been a role player for almost 40 years, right? So Dungeons and Dragons is probably the best known version of this. But I play games, and you could look at those things as being escape. So I spend plenty of time doing that, and I spend plenty of time involved in my work projects, and I spend plenty of time involved in my clients and other things. There are other things that occupy my mind. The difference with the escape is that, yes, sometimes I need a break from this stuff, but I'm not trying to get away from it in quite the same way. I'm not trying to completely put it out of my mind all of the time. I'm not trying to deny it. When I have the energy, I look at it full on, and I take it seriously, and I try to, absorb it. Because there is something after just anxiety, right? Anxiety is an early response to it. And of course, as things ramp up, right, that anxiety sometimes returns. But, the question is not at a certain point like, is this happening? What if it happens? It's happening now. So the question is, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And that's really the only question that exists, right? It's not a question of, is this going to happen or isn't it going to happen? In that sense, frankly, it's like death. It's really not that different. Death is not something that people want to think about. But death is an inevitable feature of life. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Everybody we know is going to die. The question is not whether they're going to die. That's going to happen. So we can either, look at that and take it seriously, or we can look away from it. And if we look away from it, then we're often going to be surprised and shocked. We're not going to behave in ways that we want to. We're going to leave things sometimes for another day that maybe are better left now, right? Or, leave things for another day that would be better dealt with now, right? Work out our relationships with people where there are sticking points now, not wait until later, now. And do things that we like now. And I don't mean sort of bucket list stuff, but I mean, if there are parts of your life where you're saying, this drains me, it gives me nothing, it gives me no meaning, and I don't understand why I'm doing it, maybe you shouldn't be doing it. It's not that we can do everything that we want all the time, but we need to ask serious questions if indeed it is the case that things are going to radically change inside, say, 25 years with what we want to be doing. And so I don't look away from it. I don't escape from it in the same way, but that doesn't mean I'm thinking about it all the time. I think if I was thinking about it all the time, I'd probably, I would become considerably more radical, and probably I might crack up or something. And I don't think that it's probably that useful. The places that I can, use my particular abilities and skills are places that I sort of need to have myself centered and grounded, right, to try to sort of reach people. But yeah, it's less a sideline escape from my issues and more the main course now. It's sort of at the center of things in many ways.
So I'm sorry to keep going back to Greenland, but I'm trying.
It's okay.
Do you remember what year this was?
Okay, so it wasn't last summer because COVID, and it wasn't the summer before that because COVID, I think. Is that right? 21, 20. So it must have been the summer of 2019, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I was on a trip to Hawaii with my family. So we were on the Big Island, which I had as beautiful, but and it was lovely to go. But of course, watching ecological crisis unfold also really underlined for me. I felt like I was trespassing in paradise. It's such an astoundingly beautiful place, and I had this strange feeling that's like my feet were never meant to touch this sand. Like I shouldn't be here. How much ecological damage did I do just flying here? This is like an unspoiled island in the middle of the Pacific. And of course, I'm not the first person to be there. There's been people on that island for thousands of years. But there was something about being in paradise at the moment that I was watching the world unravel that was especially striking and made me feel a deep guilt. And I still feel deeply ambivalent. I haven't done, as much travel as some people, but I've certainly traveled. And I often have a certain amount of pushback against that. Like, is this something I ought to be doing? How can I justify it? And so on and so forth. Yeah. So, yeah, that was, I believe, the summer of 2019.
What was it like for you, like watching the footage? What kind of stood out to you? Was it I don't know, was it maybe like the timestamp on it, or was it the predictions that people were making, or the things that people were saying on top of that footage? Or are you thinking more of like data?
So all of those things were present in my mind. I was already aware of the projections. I was already aware of Greenland's melt and Antarctica's melt and the Arctic melt and so on and so forth. None of those things were new to me. And it wasn't even so much the predictive arc of any of that material either. I was aware of that too. The thing that really struck me was the visual. It was the scope and the scale of it. Like looking out over something that had been a frozen ice sheet for the entire length of human history and watching it just turn into a lake. Watching these enormous rivers of water flow off of this thing. It was different than simply hearing, figures about how many gigatons of ice were melting, or hearing projections about how the landscape was going to change. I could see in real terms the fact that, like an enormous area of Greenland was melting in real time because it was hot. So it really was the visual aspect of it. And certainly I've seen many things of this kind, right? Thin Arctic ice and starving polar bears and chunks of glacier coming off in Antarctica and so on and so forth. But there was something about just the scope and scale of how much meltwater there was in Greenland that, was terrifying. Just terrifying. And, some of that, of course, plays against the data because, of course, at the same time, climate scientists were saying, oh, wow, this is where we expected things to be in the year 2075. And one of the things you get used to in this field is this faster than expected, right? Sooner than expected. So lots of these projections, when we heard them 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we were talking about this stuff happening, towards the end of the 21st century. But it's not happening towards the end of the 21st century. It's happening now. And there are an increasing number of reasons to believe that those original projections were very conservative and they didn't take into account a bunch of positive feedback mechanisms, right? Like clathrate melting, right? So the release of high levels of methane from the ocean floor and from permafrost, from tundra. So, yeah, it was just seeing these vast lakes where there had not been a lake for the entire span of human history. And realizing it's like, this is happening now. And as I said, I think this is a similar kind of effect to how people felt this past summer watching wildfires, right? Rip up the west coast of North America, rip through sections of California, rip through Australia, rip through Turkey, rip through Greece, and watching these enormous wildfires everywhere, it creates a visual effect that's totally different than what it is to merely hear statistics about warming and about the incidents. To see all of this fire, humans are deeply visual. So likewise, seeing all of this water was a jarring kind of real confirmation, something that brought it home in a way that the numbers didn't. And it, was connected to the numbers. I was interpreting it, via the numbers, but even still.
See.
Can I ask, what brought it home for you?
I think it might not be really home yet, in the sense that I haven't seen. I don't think I tie it down to a particular incident, except for like when I became aware. But I think becoming aware of this stuff is different from having the anxiety come home and hit you like, oh, it's here,
Right.
I don't think that has hit me yet. So I think right now my anxiety is a stage where I'm anticipating something. Like it's more anticipation.
Right.
Yeah, but like I don't know exactly what it was that sort of like made me realize this was all not going to last. I think it was just I just remember a couple, like, funny enough, it was I think I was in it was like in February or something. I was hard at work doing homework, and I wanted to procrastinate my homework, so naturally I went to YouTube, and then on YouTube there was this video there was this video from this TV show called The Newsroom. I don't know if you've seen it. It's,
I know this. This is a clip with Toby from The Office, right?
yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So that was very funny, and I watched it again, and after watching it like the second or third time, I was like, I feel kind of funny about this.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the reason that it's funny is because that he makes sense. So, and then this kind of just started me going down that road, and then after a couple nights of this, just looking up like this kind of stuff, basically browsing our collapse and listening to related podcasts, I started to feel like my world had kind of like collapsed a little bit.
Yeah. Our collapse will have that effect. You got to take that in small doses, as they even say on their site. This subreddit can cause mental health issues. Take in small doses. But yes, I also remember that clip from The Newsroom, and it's pretty old now, in fact. And what's remarkable about it, of course, is the things that he describes that were sort of vaguely futuristic or something at the time, now just sound like the nightly news. Right? It was very, very on point.
Yeah, it's crazy how I guess how old that clip is, because it's like a decade old now, I think. Ish.
Is it that old? I was thinking it was maybe, I got 2013 or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go back to Greenland again.
Okay.
So now I want to look at more of like, because you said you were there with your family, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering like what was their reaction to you to your reaction to it, basically, and like when they look at the footage, what do they see, and then like why do you like what are you seeing that they're not seeing?
Yeah. I mean, my spouse gets exposed to a lot of this, because in a sense she's on the front line with me every time I have a bad stretch. So she's been there and supportive many times when I have been in a particularly dark space around this. And so I told her at the time, and she has concerns about it. She has her own ways of processing and dealing with it, and she's sort of less hooked into it in some ways, I think, than I am. I have more emotional commitment, and I think I have a high tolerance. I tend to seek it out more than she does. So often she's getting it secondhand. So she gets a lot of it, but I seek it out. The rest of my family, I would just tend to say they're not very tuned into that space period. They're sort of aware of it, and I do occasionally say things that, sort of, I'll bring stuff up with them, but I just don't think it's as strong in influence. It's just not something they think about that much. And I have noticed, as many people do, that when I do try to bring it up in a strong way, what it mostly does is provoke a kind of anxiety that then shuts them down. They just can't absorb it. And I've noticed this over the years. You can't really bring people in to this, for the most part. There are some ways to do it. You can do it gently, but for the most part, you kind of can't drag somebody into this knowledge, into this space. It's something that they have to kind of come to on their own. So, I don't know. I think they're just more keyed into a kind of business as usual world. And, they're invested in the normal systems and progress of life in a lot of ways, right? Career, family, real estate, kids, all those sorts of basic pleasures and things, which is good, right? But, I do sometimes worry about that, obviously, because it's obviously not the case that just because you don't know doesn't mean that it isn't going to affect you. It is going to affect you. And so, they're just not as keyed into it, as indeed most people aren't. People, they may see this stuff here and there. They may have something of a gnawing anxiety. But in my experience, very few people are aware of the sheer scope and scale of this, that it isn't one thing. It's like 20 things, and every one of them is serious, and we don't really have an answer.
Okay. Do you have kids?
I don't.
Oh.
Not yet. I would like kids, and it's something that my partner and I have discussed even recently. But to be honest, like many people, this whole situation is something that comes up for me immediately when I consider kids. I ask myself the question of whether or not I should be increasing the population of the planet. So that's one thing. But also, if I believe my own projections and the projections of other professionals and stuff, like if I believe the data, then I have to ask myself the question of whether or not I want to bring another human being into this at this point. Like, it's hard to overstate. I really think things are going to get quite bad. And so I'd like to have kids, but do I want to have kids, in an apocalyptic hellscape? Like, as our political situation descends into fascism and we run short of food and, right? So, I had a conversation with a close friend of mine, John Vervaeke, about this recently. He's a fellow professor at U of T. And we were talking about it because I was sharing this. He has kids. And he said, I sometimes wonder whether or not if, the Jewish people in the 30s would have chosen to have kids if they had known about the Holocaust, right? If they'd known the Holocaust was coming. And I thought that was a really interesting question. It's a really interesting framing, right? Would they still have chosen to have kids if they knew that that was going to happen? And part of me comes at that question and says, well, obviously not, right? But then another part of me says, well, except, like, some people and their kids did make it through and there was hope. So this didn't quite resolve the question for me, really, but it did give me something interesting to think about. So, yes, I would like kids, but it's definitely something that I'm concerned about. And I know I'm not alone. The statistics on this, especially for people younger than me, really clearly indicate that this is a major factor for people in terms of feeling like they can't have kids, aside from economic instability and so on and so forth. But it's difficult. It's a difficult question.
I do want to go back a little bit to pick up some stuff I wanted to ask about before.
Sure.
What do you remember about can you get into more detail about sort of you when you were 7, so what you were doing like exactly and what you were researching exactly with like atomic bomb and nuclear war and stuff like that?
Sure.
Can you like draw me just a clearer picture?
A picture of it. So, at 7, I was I was a big reader. I didn't read fiction at all, but I read a ton of nonfiction. So I always had sort of 12 nonfiction books on the go. I was always a big reader. And I was in like a gifted class, so we weren't doing sort of regular assignments. I got to choose to some extent what I was working on, which is how I came around to working on an atom bomb. And I had become I don't actually even remember what got my attention on it initially, but I recall reading a book, which was a paperback, which was about what the effects of a nuclear war would be. And it, had sort of pull-out maps in the middle that showed, in North America, right, the various cities and the blast radiuses, right, what the megatonnage would be. And then it had, maps with circles around it. It's like, in this area, everybody gets vaporized. And in this area, people are burned. And in this area, everybody dies of radiation poisoning in 2 weeks. And right. So I was reading all this stuff and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And at the same time, I was really interested in Einstein. So I was reading a biography of Einstein. And of course, Einstein famously, the theory of relativity sort of enabled, in some sense, the development of atomic weaponry. But also, he wrote a letter to the US president and advised them to create the atomic bomb because they were concerned that the Germans were going to beat them to it, right? Because the Nazis were also researching this technology, although they didn't get especially close. But I was very interested in that. And then once I learned the basic mechanism of how an atomic bomb works, which is actually, it's fascinating, but it's not an especially complicated device. It's very clever in a way. And so at some point I was just sort of so full of this material, not just like how it worked, but like how the effects of this would play out in the world and the speed that it could play out with, 6 minutes. 6 minutes. 6 minutes from pushing the button to an atomic or thermonuclear, actually, right? Hydrogen bombs. But a thermonuclear, wave of fire sweeping the Earth and wiping out basically everything that we knew. 6 minutes. That idea to me was so striking. And so I felt this very strong need to communicate it. In that sense, I guess it is actually what you were saying. It's maybe not so different than what I'm doing now. But, and at that point I was like, and look, here's how an atom bomb works. I built one out of a shampoo bottle. Not a working one, obviously, but like a little model that demonstrated how it worked and stuff. So yeah, I mean, I had a fascination, I suppose, with it. It was one of these things that, what it was a bit like? Dinosaurs. When you're a kid and you are really interested in dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are cool because they're, great big toothy monsters, right? But one of the things that's really cool about them is that they're real, right? Like they were real. They actually walked around. It's not like, a dragon or a troll or something, which I assume weren't real. Maybe they were, who knows? But I don't think so. So, the thing about dinosaurs is they're this enormous, toothy, terrifying monster, but also they were real. And this was like that. It was like, the Death Star in Star Wars, except it was real. It was real and it was right there. And this was during a period of time when the tensions of the Cold War were high enough that there was a significant possibility that this might happen. Like that was something that got drilled into me in the early 80s as a kid. We had gone past stop, drop, and roll, or, duck and cover, right? Get underneath your desk. Your desk isn't going to help you. If the bomb goes off, that's it. You're done. Probably if you're in the immediate blast area. So, growing up with the idea, it's like, oh yeah, in 6 minutes, if people get mad at each other, if they get mad enough at each other, somebody can push a button and then in 6 minutes, right? Flash of light, game over. Or if you're farther away, even worse, because like your hair falls out and you die of radiation poisoning. Yeah, it's nasty. So yeah, and I had seen depictions of it in films, right? In Terminator, in a terrific TV movie called The Day After, which is it's pretty terrifying. It's low budget for a TV movie, but pretty terrifying. I'd seen lots of stuff that depicted it, but I became very interested in it. And I began to have regular nightmares that carried until my mid-20s. My mid-20s, I was still occasionally having atomic war dreams, or nuclear war dreams.
Can you tell me more about these nightmares you have, and if they have continued, or do you get climate change nightmares now?
No, I don't. I don't get climate change nightmares. I Yeah. So there are two kinds of nightmares that I've gotten commonly through much of my life. One is nuclear war dreams, and the other is zombie dreams. And for the most part, both of them have dropped off. But I've had zombie dreams for much of my life. I was very interested in zombie movies when I was a kid, before zombies got big. And zombie movies I eventually figured out. My fear of zombies is my fear of the masses, right? My fear of zombies is my fear of the masses. It's the public. And this comes out of my, family psychology and stuff, but it's like, it's a big group of people who just eat, and if they catch you, they can turn you into one of them, and they're not dangerous individually, but they're dangerous in a group. My atomic war dreams, I've had lots of them, but the more recent ones that I remember more clearly in some way, I often used to get them when the tensions were really high between India and Pakistan. And usually I would be doing something in the dream, and all of a sudden I would see the bright flash of light, and I would go to the window, and I would look out the window, and I would see, the mushroom cloud starting to rise up. And then all of a sudden things would be shaking, and there would be like a fierce wind, and it would smash the windows in, and so on and so forth. And usually at that point I would wake up. And I often woke up with this peculiar idea that was like, oh, this sounds strange. I used to wake up with the idea that I had somehow skipped between universes. So I was just in the universe where, in fact, the nukes went off, and somehow I jumped over to another timeline. That was often my first thought when I woke up, which is kind of a crazy science fiction idea. But they usually had kind of that basic format. It was like seeing it in the distance, and then boom, right? Very impersonal. It's not like I was involved in it. It was just something that would happen, right? And I would see the fireball rising and the flash of light and so on. And I've had sort of, variations on that in one way or another for a very long time. But I haven't had many. It's been a while since I've had one. I think mostly because a lot of this stuff I've pulled into my consciousness. So I'm thinking about it consciously, and it doesn't have the same kind of impact for my dream life.
Do you have when do you? Because I know that once you become collapse aware, you kind of see the world differently. Do you?
Oh, yeah.
When you go out and you see like signs of instability and things like that, do you sort of like? I kind of see something, and then like my mind just takes it, and then it starts to run away with it, and it starts to construct this whole scenario. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I know what you mean. I see some of that. I mean, that goes pretty far back to the sort of material collapse of our civilization. It's something I would see more often in the news, but every once in a while I see it in the real world. I'll see something specific happening. It's not uncommon, for instance, with weather. So, you'll have like a freaky, uncommonly warm winter day, right? It'll be like 18 degrees in January or something. And I'll look and I'll think, feels nice outside, but this is not good. This isn't supposed to be happening like this, and my mind will stick on it in certain kinds of ways. And the same thing happens sometimes when I encounter, so for instance, the fireflies. When I noticed that this field that had always had fireflies near my hometown just didn't have them anymore. They were just gone. And that hit me really, really hard because I don't know. It was just something. It was like nature was going quiet. And that was before I even knew about collapse in insect populations, So there was something, again, it's very visual, right? But it's like I went past this field that had always been fireflies. It had been alive with fireflies. But now I looked at it and maybe I would see one or two or none. They were just gone. So in some ways, it's like that. Sometimes I see things and it's striking because it's something that shouldn't be happening, right? But a lot of the time, what I actually notice, the thing that tends to scare me is what's missing. It's the things that are going, away. And a lot of those things, of course, are going away and they're not coming back. Even if we solve the global warming problem, there's nothing we can do about biodiversity collapse. Like once these species are gone, for the most part, they're gone. We can save their genetic material, but that's not the same thing. Trying to reintroduce a species from its genetic material is, we've never really done it at all. So, yeah. yeah, those things get stuck in my mind. And lots of news things will get stuck in my mind, specific bits of fact and stuff that I come across, and it'll really, really hammer me for a while. Nanoplastics or microplastics are something I now think about a lot. So, yeah.
I don't know if you talked about this before, but is there a particular aspect of climate change that kind of looms over everything else for you? That this is the thing that like that's gonna kill me, or this is the thing that I'm thinking about all the time.
No. I mean, this is the thing. I tend to have, because I maintain a relatively broad awareness of all of the different converging factors, I tend to sort of go between one and another. So I'll start with one and I'll run the consequences on that, and then I'll be like, okay, but that's not a solitary issue. And then I will bounce to the next thing, and then I'll be like, okay, but that's not a solitary issue. This is one of the things that makes it so difficult to untangle and attempt to come up with any kind of a response to, is that there are so many different factors that are tangled together, not including factors that are sort of invisible to us at present because we keep finding new things. So as I said, microplastics, I haven't even begun to formulate a response to. This is like the plastics that we put into our environment are breaking down in ever finer particles. Increasing amounts of research shows that aside from the fact that they're getting, gobbled up by fish and birds and clogging up their digestive systems, they're also working their way down to a scale where they're beginning to interfere with cellular membranes. And at that point, it's like, okay, like the ocean is full of it, the water is full of it, the air is full of it. We're breathing it. We have found it in the placenta of babies, so they have it from birth. What do we do about that? What are we supposed to do? Vacuum the entire atmosphere? I don't know. What if it breaks down even finer? I don't know. I have no response to it at all. I just know, shit. Okay, you gotta bleep that. I just know, shoot. I don't know. Like I'm breathing microscopic toxins. So there isn't much to do there. Likewise, biodiversity collapse. Some of that is, we're destroying habitat. And so who knows how many species we've eradicated just without even knowing that they were there, right? We never knew that they existed and we wiped them out and they aren't coming back. And, the state of biodiversity is like a game of Jenga. You can pull out blocks and the tower doesn't go down. But if you pull out enough blocks, it goes down. Like you can't just sustain in some ways. That doesn't even get into problems like, say, commercial overfishing, right? The amount of fish that we eat is utterly unsustainable, and we've been dragging giant steel nets across the ocean floor, destroying those biomes. And at some point, there just aren't going to be fish, which will be a rude shock to the vast proportion of the planet that lives on fish. And we're going to see pretty quickly how well we can live on krill, algae, and jellyfish. So things like that. And then on top of that, there's things like ocean acidification, right? So as CO2 goes up and temperatures go up, more CO2 gets dissolved in the ocean. That increases the acidity levels. That dissolves the shells of small organisms. A team of Scottish researchers, the community is not in total agreement with them, but a team of Scottish researchers has now predicted that within 25 years, plankton will be done. Ocean acidification will kill them. Well, they provide something like 40% of the oxygen on the planet. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. No idea. Okay? Global warming, increased, energy, right? So global warming, greenhouse gases, climate change, increased energy to storms, unpredictable weather patterns, droughts, floods, freezes, crop failures. All of those things feeding forward into more habitat loss, more biodiversity loss, and on and on and on and on and on. Right? So these things all interlock together. And that's before you even get into the knock-on effects, because there are going to be knock-on economic effects to all of that. There are going to be knock-on effects in terms of human dynamics, right? And that in turn is going to lead to political effects, which is to say that, it seems increasingly likely that as this happens and we see greater movements of refugees, we're going to see the same kinds of dynamics we've seen thus far, which is to say fascism. We're going to see fascism all over the place and totalitarian governments, and we're already seeing it. So, I don't know. I don't know how to tease that apart. it isn't that there's any one factor that concerns me. It's that, as I said, there are, and 20 is probably a conservative number, but there are 20 different factors tangled together. Now, there is one answer I can see, and the answer is that if, I really do believe, John Vervaeke's models, and we have different approaches to this, but I believe John Vervaeke's idea that if we could adjust our sense of meaning and our sense of ourself, if we can evolve ourselves in intentional self-transformation, then we might have some kind of shot to actually solve these problems. But, as they stand, I don't have the foggiest idea. I have no idea how we could address these things. And I don't think anybody else does either. Except, of course, changing absolutely everything. But that's an open question. Simply saying it would be in our rational best interest to change absolutely everything is not a good sell. Humans are not rationally motivated for the most part in that way. So how do we bring it home to people, emotionally speaking, that, this is something that needs to happen, that everybody's standard of living needs to change, right? Or everybody in the first world, at any rate, standard of living needs to change, right? That maybe we need to overhaul our entire economic system, that maybe we need to rethink our relationship to the world. That is difficult, especially in the time span we're talking about.
I'd like to roll it back a little bit to how climate awareness and anxiety has changed the way you see normal things. And I guess I'm trying to drive towards some of the things you told me in our last interview about like when your friends get pregnant, what do you think? Retirement. Tell me about your increased appreciation for food and your soup shelf.
Oh, the soup shelf. Okay. Yeah, I experienced very mixed feelings, in the last 10 years when friends have had kids. And I've had a bunch of friends, get pregnant, and I've had a bunch of friends have children. And every time they're announced this, I have this strange mixed feeling. I'm very ambivalent. Because on one hand, I'm happy for them. That's great. I'm happy for them. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, this is adding one more human to this problem, for one thing. But also, even if we leave the open question of overpopulation aside, what is this person going to experience? What is their life going to be like? What is the world they're going to have? So when I think about somebody having a kid, I think, a lot of the time I see a young kid and I think, sorry, kid. Sorry. We ate it. Sorry. It's a very mixed feeling. I'm kind of making a joke here, but I find it very difficult and moving and tragic. It's hard for me. Likewise, there are certain kinds of social promises that I think were made that, for all kinds of reasons, economic and otherwise, aren't coming through. So, I abandoned the idea of the possibility of retirement quite some time ago. As I mentioned, I sort of started my main career somewhat later than other people, but also above and beyond that, I just don't think the social framework is going to be there. The economics are going to be there. Also, in theory, if I was going to retire, I would do that in, if I was doing it early, I would do it in 12 years? That's unlikely. But let's say that I was going longer, 22 years. In 22 years, in my opinion, things are going to be so far off the rails that the concept of retirement as we would normally think of it is, it's not going to exist. There isn't going to be a stable world to retire to. So that's difficult. And then in terms of food, that's hard too. I really like food, and it's not uncommon that I eat something and I think to myself, I should really enjoy this now, because this may not be available. Coffee is a good example of this. I like a good cup of coffee, but I've been aware for a long time that coffee crops are extremely sensitive to certain kinds of climate shocks and fungi and monoculture and issues of transport and globalization. Coffee is going to be one of the things to go first. And I've been making this joke for years, but if you want to shut down the Western world, North America, you want to shut down North America, it's not about cutting off oil. It's about cutting off coffee. If you cut off the oil, people would figure it out. If you cut off the coffee, there's going to be riots in the streets, So, it's not uncommon that I look at those sorts of things and I think I should really enjoy this now, right? I eat while at the same time recognizing that I'm contributing to a problem. When I'm eating a mango that was imported from wherever, this is not a sustainable set of practices. When I'm eating a lobster, this is not a sustainable set of practices, and so on and so forth. The soup shelf thing you were mentioning was this was an early response that I had. So, when I didn't have the same kind of economic means, but I was still concerned about this, I decided that the wise thing to do would be to do what people had historically done and get some extra food, right? Prior to the last couple of generations with just-in-time delivery and so on and so forth, people kept extra food on hand. It was called a pantry. They did this in the Great Depression, and it was a good idea because sometimes you had food and sometimes you didn't, right? So I decided I would just invest in a bunch of canned goods, right? And then I would have canned goods. And I was putting these canned goods on my shelves, like I was stacking them on shelves, and this was not a good use of shelf space. But at some point, what I realized was that I could literally make shelves out of canned goods. So soup cans, especially, are, stiff metal modular stacking units. So what I realized was that if you stacked up soup cans in a certain way and you put like a 6-foot long, 1 foot wide, 1 inch thick pine board, you could literally build bookshelves out of them. And 3 soup cans tall is a hardcover, and 2 soup cans tall is a paperback. It's almost perfect. So I had a quite big place at the time, and my walls were completely lined in bookshelves that I had made out of soup and boards. They're also really easy to, take. If you move, they're really easy to move. Just take all the cans down, stick them in, stack the boards, and away you go. But a lot of people, of course, obviously saw my soup can shelves, and if I couldn't convince them that I was doing an Andy Warhol art experiment, they basically thought I was a crazy person. As far as I'm concerned, it's just like, look, this is the cheapest form of insurance in the world. Sometimes things happen. The power goes out, there's a flood, there's a freeze, there's a hurricane, there's an earthquake. Like, things happen. And when things happen, it's often good to have some extra food. And certainly as far as climate is concerned, right, when that system of industrial scale agriculture begins to break down, people are going to find that food is not as super abundant as it used to be. And indeed, we're even now seeing, for economic and ecological reasons, we're seeing quite substantial jumps in the price of food that I think are really catching people. We're seeing, some of this is inflation, right, which is driven by primary economic factors, but some of it is ecological. 50% of the wheat harvest failed this year, so the price of pasta and bread are going to go through the roof. And people are looking at this and going, oh my God, like, why is everything so much? And the answer is because it's falling apart. That's why. And you should get ready for this. Like, you should get kind of used to it, So, not that I'm recommending soup can shelves to everybody. That's maybe an acquired taste. And hilariously, I built them all out of tomato soup, which I don't even like that much. But anyway.
Yeah, I did come to the same realization about coffee as well. And I'm torn between stockpiling more instant coffee, which I've learned lasts forever, and trying to wean myself off coffee because I know it's not gonna be, it's gonna dry up.
Yeah, I've done a bit of both. So I drink much less coffee, and because caffeine is indispensable, I own a lot of caffeine. Caffeine pills are the cheapest caffeine going, and I've just had them on subscription for years, and I stick them away because I've just learned, like, having a bit of caffeine can really make the difference between a good day and a bad day, quite frankly. But I also have like a substantial stockpile of coffee for if things get a bit disrupted, crack it open on a Christmas morning or whatever.
Makes sense. What are your opinions on bringing this into the mainstream? So, like, bringing systems collapse into sort of like normalizing it.
Right. So I think to some extent it actually is already entering common discourse. As I said, right, COVID played a big role in that. The kind of political deadlocking that we've seen all over the globe seems to be playing a role in that. And the recent very dramatic examples of climate change, I think, are waking a lot of people up to this idea that, hey, wait a minute, like, things are, this is strange, and maybe we need to do something. So I think it's already kind of coming to people's attention. But there are a few forces at work that make it difficult to sort of form a broad public consensus around it. So one is the force which originally sort of originates with an analysis of the Soviet Union called hypernormalization. So, hypernormalization is this idea that we sort of can adjust to anything. And so as things get worse, we're just like, yeah, that's the way it's always been. As things change, people have a tendency to just adjust to those circumstances. So that's already at work, in my opinion. When you look at the way things were 50 years ago and the way that things are now, it's actually quite obvious to me that we've already changed quite a lot, and we've sort of normalized it right into this idea of how things are and how they've been. We experience less birdsong, we get fewer bugs, and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect. Hypernormalization makes it difficult for people to absorb. The other aspect, of course, is that you get a funny thing, which is that people will stack evidence up to resist something up to a point. But then once it becomes super clear, what you often see is that people will then go on board with it and claim they were always on board with it. Right? It's a method of not engaging in cognitive dissonance. And it's quite common. You'll see it all the time, where people will suddenly switch their stance. Politicians are masters at this, where they'll push back against something for years and years and years, and then suddenly say, I've always been in support of this. And I think you're going to see some of that. But in general, it strikes me that the scale of this is so big that we're not designed for it. Right? Evolution has not equipped us to deal with things at this scale of change. I mean, basically, we've lived as a species our entire existence, and certainly the entire existence of sort of civilization, broadly construed history, right? Within a certain very stable bubble of time. The idea that that can change, we're not great at it. And some of the things that are required, the comment has been made, and I wish I could remember who this quote is, but there's a famous quote, right? It's easier for us to imagine the end of civilization than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? So when we even consider what small changes might be necessary, and I'm not necessarily advocating for socialism, but certainly commercialist exploitative capitalism as we currently have it is not helping. Like, it's clearly accelerating the problem. I don't know. I think we're going to try to do a certain amount of adaptation. I have a hope, and this is going to sound terrible in the frame of hope, but I have a hope that people will wake up once something sufficiently big happens. But I suspect that sufficiently big is probably something on the scale of 1 billion people dying. And like that's a concept that's hard to wrap your head around. But it's not implausible. There are quite a few areas in the world where their water supply is being critically impacted by climate change. And if there's no water, you look at the rivers that feed the Indian subcontinent. If there's no water, how are all those people going to survive? And the answer is they aren't. And the same goes for, lots of other places. There are lots of areas that are, relatively sort of unstable. And Canada has, I think, decided that because it's relatively stable in these terms, people here, I think, have gone a kind of like, well, things here will be fine. We'll have slightly warmer summers. We'll be able to grow our crops in Sudbury or something. And this is nonsense. The idea that things here are going to be fine in some way. They're not. And in that way, frankly, the wildfires ripping through BC were hopefully eye-opening for people. But I don't know what it's going to take to onboard it. If we can't get it now, what is it going to take for us to get it? And hopefully something that is sufficiently serious. But my hopes are there, but my rational confidence is not high. We couldn't get everybody to agree about COVID. The likelihood that we're going to get everybody to agree about this, it's a very political issue.
So you have noticed an increasing number of people coming on board with this idea, right? Who are more freaked out by.
Mm-hmm.
So you see this in your students and colleagues?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, in some of the people that I know, people were already sort of awake to this. So there is a group of friends that I have who I've been talking about this stuff for years, and, we're all on terms with this. People have their specializations, one person will be, I have a friend who was really into pandemic theory over the last 15 years. And so they got to X their bingo card off with COVID. But, the broader public, for sure. I see far more students that are terrified of it. I have seen comments from clients, psychotherapeutic clients, who seem to be increasingly concerned. And, I've heard mentions from family and friends who previously were not especially worried about this stuff. And again, there I see something of a positive note, because although I said previously that you can't kind of drag somebody into it, when somebody does express a concern, that opens a door where if they're like, does it seem to you like this is really screwy? That opens up a conversation in that area where you can start to say, well, yeah, that's actually a really interesting subject because blah, 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 right? And start to zone in on it. And often that can plant the seed, which, I mean, as you were describing in your own experience, right? It's like you hear something and that sort of sets it off in your head. And then often you go down the rabbit hole and one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. And at that point, part of the problem is trying to give people the containment that they need to process this material without it just, making them want to like throw themselves in front of traffic or something, right? Which is a real possibility. It's terrifying. So, yeah.
My professor was also interested in this. What do you say to students and colleagues who ask you now, well, what's the point of anything then? Why do I do anything? What's the point of school? Why do anything at all?
Yeah. So that's tricky, because I have, frankly, an ambivalent relationship to the social role of school. I mean, I was a high school dropout for a reason, right? I think that the university, in particular, has decided that it's a job training program, and that's not what it was historically. We've had 1,000 years of universities, and that's not what universities were. They weren't job training programs. So this is a very strange idea to me, and I think that, to some extent in Canada and to a much larger extent in the States, lots of people are looking at school and asking themselves the question, like, what is this doing for me? Is this actually doing something for me that's useful, or am I just racking up an insane amount of debt in order, right? Because it's now become the minimum bar. To do a paper shuffling job, I have to have a bachelor's, which is nuts. It's crazy, right? So often what I say to my students is the thing you have to remember is school is just school. It's one thing. It's one part of life. Life is bigger and more important than school. And life is about people over projects. Yeah, I mean, the basics of it is this. One of the things that I say to students is that they need to ask themselves the question of whether or not something like university is actually what really meets their needs. It's not the only way through life. And school is only one part of life. It's not life. One of the problems is, for lots of students, they start in kindergarten or junior kindergarten or nursery school. They go through 12 grades and then they go straight into university. And school is all they've ever known. It's the only thing they've ever known. And so, of course, it seems really important, right? Grades and schools, but it's just one thing. It's one aspect of life. It's not useless, but your life is more important than school. And your life is about people, typically speaking. Of course, there are other kinds of projects and things, but people is what it's about. So that's one thing, is I relativize it. I try to let people know that school is not all there is. And that if they're not sort of getting something out of school, they need to seriously consider that, right? Shouldn't just do it just because. In terms of the other stuff, it's like, I think we all need to ask ourselves some hard questions about what we want to do. But the thing is that this is, as I said before, not fundamentally different than the basic questions that confront us existentially every day for all of human history because of the question of death. It's just a question of death, right? And it's a little different. It's hard to process because it's like, well, if we're seriously talking about our civilization coming apart at the seams, right? Ugh. Like a lot of the things we think of as making things worthwhile in the spite of death, like, oh, well, I'll leave a legacy, or, I'll be part of some overall movement. It's like, yeah, but that too turns to dust maybe, right? These are big problems, but they're not new problems. They're things that humans have been dealing with all along. And so the question is, we can't just give in and, party like crazy people, right? That's not a good response. But at the same time, we can't put off our lives forever, right? We can't say, well, I'll live my life next year. I'll live my life in 5 years. I'll just get through this, and then, my real life will start. Your real life is now. And if things radically change in 25 years, it's not like, I think people are going to be like, oh, dang, everything's on fire. I have regrets, about what I did. It's just like, we have to ask this question. It's exactly the same question as the question of death and has to be dealt with the same tools. So other than that, I just try to support people. It's like, try not to get caught up in a sense of powerlessness, but instead focus on what you can do. See things clearly as possible, as clearly as we can, because we can't see the future, and make plans accordingly. Try to do certain things that build resiliency, creating relationships, learning some skills, right? But not like in a hardcore survivalist, go build a bunker way. I don't think that stuff works especially well. Nevertheless, it might be useful to, acquire a skill set other than, a search engine optimization or something, right? Because that may end up being less important. So,
What would you say to people who have sort of fallen more into the despair side of things, who have who say like, well, the problem is so big, it's unfixable, this so far beyond me, all this climate change stuff. Why don't I just lie in bed and wait for it all to pass? I can't do anything.
yeah, so one thing I would say is you may want to consider seeing a therapist. Well, seriously, speaking as a therapist, that can be a really helpful experience. Now, don't get me wrong, not every therapist is equally well equipped for this either. One of the times I was experiencing when I was younger, really bad anxiety, I went to a therapist and was talking about this stuff. And after about 5 minutes, I could see the look on her face. Sorry, I'm laughing, that's terrible. I could see the look on her face because clearly, like, I was spooking her as I was kind of going through this, right? I was giving her like the litany of, and this, and this, and this. And I'm watching as she goes pale and I'm thinking, oh no, like I came in to get help and now I've given the therapist an anxiety disorder. But, seeing a therapist is a good response. But the other thing is to sit with it, to sit with your feelings. Because the tendency is to not sit with it. The tendency is to engage in escapism, to engage in denial, right? To fight it. But instead, when it's a kind of fact about the world, it's something you need to take seriously. And there are pathways of action for our lives which work no matter what. So as an example, when I decided to become a therapist, one of the reasons I did so is I reasoned thusly. If the economy is really good, okay, then people will want therapy, because the economy being really good doesn't stop people from wanting therapy, and there will be lots of clients, right, working through existential issues and whatever. If the economy is less good, right, people will want therapy, because when the economy is poor, people are stressed out, and so they're going to want therapy. And if the economy completely collapses, it doesn't matter what my job is, because I'm going to have a new job, right, like brewing potions and making crossbows or something. So, right, the point is, like, it's the kind of job that works no matter what. It's like, being a dentist or owning a bar. If you own a bar, times are good. Let's drink. Times are bad. Let's drink. Everything is on fire. It doesn't matter. So there are lots of responses that you can have, right, that are flexible responses. But there are other responses that do not go flexibly. And right? So thinking about that stuff is a bit of a rational handle, but mostly it's you need to really sit with your feelings and process them, right? Sit with your feelings and process them. Let them process, because we can process. It's grieving. And like any other form of grieving, it can be processed. It's just hard and it feels bad. And the processing won't destroy you. It'll make you stronger, but you need to set the time and let yourself feel your feelings. Let yourself feel your sadness. Let yourself feel your fear. Let yourself feel your disappointment. Let yourself feel your anger, right? These are strong feelings, but they're valid feelings. Like, why wouldn't we be angry? Like, the world got destroyed. That's kind of crap, right? Things aren't going to go the way that we imagined. That's not great, right? And things may be a lot harder than we all expected. And, it's sad. It's hard. But it's also honest. And if you come to that, if you do that work, if it doesn't go that way, then you're just pleasantly surprised. It's like expecting a movie is going to be terrible, and then you go into it and it's like okay, and so you're like, actually that was pretty good. But if you expected it was going to be amazing and you go in and it's okay, you're highly disappointed. Right? So sitting with your feelings and possibly contacting somebody to help work with your feelings also helps to have some friends if you're interested in this sort of thing that you can talk about this stuff with, right? Because you're really not alone. Lots of people are experiencing this. Lots of people.
So, I think where we left off was I was trying to sort of lead you into that speech about what each individual person can do.
Right.
That resonated with me a lot. Like the last time we spoke.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the crux of it is, you see a pattern of thinking very often in cases of, say, depression, where people engage in certain kinds of all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking. So there's often a tendency, if people are depressed, to say things like, well, I fail at everything. I failed at everything, right? And one of the ways that you come at that is to kind of question the absoluteness of the statement, right? Well, do you really fail at everything? It's like, well, not everything, right? In the same way, I think it's often the case that when people are initially confronted with this material and they start to absorb it, it can be quite overwhelming. And they sort of throw their hands in the air and say, well, there's nothing I can do. And furthermore, there's nothing that's worth doing at all. And so, one of the things I think that people can do likewise is challenge that kind of absoluteness, right? It's not the case that there's nothing you can do, right? Yes, it may be the case that you can't necessarily change the course of multinational oil companies or something, but that doesn't mean that you can't be operating within a community space, that you can't be learning things, that you can't be acquiring skills, and importantly, that you can't be connecting with other people. So, trying to engage with that space in a way that breaks the problem up a little bit, rather than making it seem like kind of a monolithic brick wall, right, where there's no gaps, there's no way through, is quite important.
I can't remember if you spoke about this today, but how do you think the way societies historically have reacted to disasters, how do you think that has relevance to how climate anxiety and the effects of climate change will play out?
Yeah, I mean, there are in a sense kind of multiple countervailing trends, and so it's difficult to predict things in the long run. So, as I already mentioned, one of the effects that we certainly see is that as the effects of climate change kick in, we're going to see that disproportionately affect the developing world and sort of the tropical bands around the Earth, and that is likely to cause, and is already causing, significant migration. And those kinds of migrations and refugee situations have been shown over and over again to catalyze quite negative forces, typically speaking, at a social level, right? They tend to drive societies to being more exclusive and more, totalitarian often, right, in an attempt to sort of control their space, control their borders, keep people out. So there is definitely a trend that we're seeing in that direction. However, I am encouraged by the fact that when you actually look at how people respond as a community under stress, right, whether it's sort of military stress, right, like a war zone, conflict zone, or it's a natural disaster situation. In fact, people engage in huge amounts of mutual support, and more to the point, people typically actually refer to these periods of their life as being the most meaningful periods of their life. Often people feel energized because there are sort of immediate problems to deal with. And one of the problems, of course, that our society currently faces is the sort of flood of what the writer David Graeber has, I think, quite pointedly referred to as bullshit jobs, which I think is not a bleepable swear word in this context because it's a technical term. So, right, the flood of sort of bullshit jobs, this idea that we are all, or many of us, right, are employed in ways where we don't see any meaningful connection to what we're doing. There doesn't seem to be any point to much of it. Whereas being in an environment that has high consequences, high stakes, what you're doing matters, you're connecting to other people, you're trying to solve goals that, or problems rather, in domains that are really much closer to what we've actually evolved for. People often report feeling more community integrated, more meaningful despite the difficulty. And you often, in fact, curiously enough, in war zones, see a drop in mental illness, which people find quite counterintuitive. So, for instance, in London, during the Blitz, during World War II, there was a sharp drop in the reports of mental illness. And many people who were previously considered to be sort of institutionalizable instead took up jobs of various kinds, running courier messages, doing this kind of thing, right? So there is something about this kind of pressure that actually tends to cause people to form community ties and band together. And people are often skeptical when they hear that. But if you think about what it's like when there's a big power outage, that I think is actually a pretty good sort of initial measure. Now, that's not to say that people, of course, can't get quite difficult and that we won't potentially see social changes with lots of, many of the same things we're seeing now. Tribalism, right? An increased amount of tribalism, a decreased amount of tolerance, and so on and so forth. But, there are indeed some sort of hopeful trends blowing in the opposite direction. Human beings, by and large, actually prefer to work together, all things being equal. I mean, yes, of course, we all picture the post-apocalyptic cannibal Mohawk motorcycle punks. And, I imagine that too when I imagine a post-apocalyptic scenario. But no, I don't think that that's terribly likely. However, I mean, one of the things here is we're really in somewhat unknown territory, with the exception of a few relatively large-scale events, within sort of recorded history, right? So the Bronze Age collapse stands out as a period where, more civilizations went out of existence in a relatively short span of time than any other period in history. There was a period of time very early, prehistory, right? But a period early in sort of the human span, I think 800,000 years ago, if I recall, where the human population dropped to 10,000 individuals, right? We almost went extinct as a species. So our species has gone through some quite difficult bottlenecks in the past. The thing is, we don't have any records, right? We have very little idea what happened in that period. It does seem, for instance, in the Bronze Age collapse that there were large migrant groups and that probably they were attacking each other. But it's extremely hard to decode, right? Archaeology is a very difficult, tricky interpretive science, and there's a lot of interpretations. So with something like this, it'll really be unprecedented. We don't know in some ways how we're going to react because, we've never really grappled with a disaster on a global scale. We have no idea. So I hope that sort of the better angels of our nature win out, and that we realize that, there's no such thing as a lone wolf, right? Not even with wolves. Lone wolves do very poorly. Wolves are pack animals, right? They're social creatures. So are humans. The idea that people are going to stick it out in an apocalypse bunker with, 10 AR-15s and a bunch of Mountain House food is a mirage. That's not how people make it through these kinds of situations. We make it through with community, small-scale community. So my inclination is to say that is going to be probably the dominant factor even in a collapse of this kind. However, another thing that has been happening consistently through human history is war. So it's hard to say, right? It's hard to say how that's going to happen. I very much doubt that things are going to descend into cannibalism. But we'll see.
I guess what you're basically saying is that community building is sort of the best way forward. And do you think we should this is something we should start now?
Yes, we should start now. And I'm a pretty strong advocate in many ways. I'm not a great fan of social media. So I've been very selective in my uptake of different technologies. I have no problems uptaking a technology if it seems relatively straightforwardly useful to me. But there are many technologies that I'm sort of resistant to, and social media has been one of them. I've been quite resistant to Facebook and many things in that sphere. And part of the reason is that it seems to me that the sense of community which Facebook purports to provide us is not real community. We form sort of numerically coded, very weak ties with people that we don't know very well in an online space. What we need to do if we're going to start sort of building the kinds of networks that we need to build, is that we need to start forming these ties in the real world with people who are our neighbors. It's fine to have like an interest and a tie with somebody who shares an interest of yours, in a country that's thousands of kilometers away. And it's good to have those lines of communication open. But ultimately speaking, when a situation goes into a kind of collapse, when a civilization starts reducing in complexity, one of the things that happens is that it becomes profoundly more local. And as such, having some sense of your neighbors and the communities around you and who you can work with and what people are capable of is extremely important. So I think that, for people who are interested in this sort of thing, connecting up with mutual aid enterprises is a really important sort of early aspect to this. Also, of course, it's the case that for many who are interested in this subject now, they are still, quite frankly, on the leading edge of a subject. And if these predictions bear out the way that they seem to be progressing, then those people are going to be, in some sense, ahead of the curve. They will have significantly emotionally adjusted to the reality of the situation before the other people around them. And so that puts those people in an important role, right? Because when everybody else is freaking out as they, are updating their models to account for sudden changes, right? For many people who have already done some of the work of processing this, they're going to be like, okay, like I kind of already know what to do. In terms of building community, it's, the key thing is to obviously get to know the people in your area, to get to know your neighbors, but also to find sort of like-minded people in the surrounding area. So mutual aid communities, people that are interested in more localized forms of farming, that sort of thing is going to be important. People who are interested in the maintenance and modification and production of machinery. So I actually think that maker spaces, for instance, are going to end up being probably a significant contributor in lots of ways. And of course, just, making friends in a wide variety of different professions and things. People are very often quite siloed in a certain sense within their professional set. They do something for a living and they mostly hang around with people who do sort of similar sorts of things. And one of the things that can go a long way towards community building exercises is trying to step outside of that and making friends and acquaintances across a relatively wide social range. But that's probably the main thing that people can do. And as an early step, that has the added benefit of addressing the fact that, frankly, people are very lonely. Despite all the social media that we have, people typically report a relatively low degree of social contact and social engagement. So, in a sense, doing that kind of social connection work not only connects us together with sort of a meaningful project and enables us to develop the tools and skills that we need to be able to navigate this sort of thing, but it more directly addresses one of the major sources of meaning within a human life, right? The sense of community and belonging. So it's kind of win-win.
You're kind of like heading in this general direction that these collapses, they're the end of they're gonna be the end of a lot of things, but also there's a lot of new opportunities and new beginnings that are possible, right? For example, like the collapse of our of society as we know it does provide new opportunities or maybe an answer to this meaning crisis that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the conflation that people sometimes engage in is to believe that the end of civilization or the collapse of civilization is the end of the world. And that's not true. There are, as I mentioned, sort of various degrees of severity that even something like a climate change model can go through. And although I happen to believe, given the science, that it is quite likely that our current, technologically driven, globally distributed, consumer capitalist culture is not going to make it. That doesn't mean that humans aren't going to make it. So the idea is that, there have been different configurations of culture in the past. And indeed, it's very often the case that what we see historically is that after a period of sort of tremendous hardship and darkness, right, we often see a degree of kind of innovation and flourishing in human culture in response to that. So the Black Death is a good example of this. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which was an absolutely devastating pandemic event, right? We see enormous amounts of social innovation and freedom, a real flowering in some sense of intellectual and spiritual and social innovation. We see the same thing after the Bronze Age collapse. We see the same thing during the sort of hardships of, the Greek city-state period and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, the aftermath of these kinds of disasters is fertile ground for human beings. And of course, realistically, frankly, even if, we hit one of the really bad scenarios, 6 degrees warming. If we see 6 degrees average global warming, odds are humans are not going to survive in any, significant numbers. But that doesn't mean the world is going anywhere. Most of the species we're familiar with won't be around, but the world will be just fine. The planet will go on without us. It's seen worse and been through worse than whatever we can dish at it. So, the question that we have to ask then is what kind of role we are going to play. And, every configuration of life, every configuration of civilization and culture offers certain advantages and certain disadvantages. There are lots of different ways to put your civilization together. We've focused in a certain kind of direction, and there are some advantages to it, advantages that hopefully we preserve. So, as I'm quite fond of saying, I don't think, if our civilization collapses, unless things, really do go down to the motorcycle cannibal punk level, we're still going to have radio. Radio is a sufficiently sophisticated technology, but it's also relatively easy to build. You can power a radio with a lemon. So, as long as we don't utterly destroy the biosphere, I suspect we're going to preserve radio. So the idea that we're going back to, the Middle Ages, right, that, we're going to go back to the year 1000 or something, it strikes me as very unlikely. We're going to be moving into a new period with its own potentials and its own possibilities. And hopefully we'll be able to preserve some of the discoveries and wisdom of our period, but to return to a more balanced and integrated and earth-centered, life-centered kind of version and vision of things. So I actually think that really there's a lot of potential there. Much as during the pandemic when people were sort of suddenly forced to stay home, and that was difficult for people, but it also represented real opportunities for people as they realized they got to spend more time with their family. They got to have a slower pace of life, right? It was quite eye-opening. Similarly, when you have like a snow day, like a big snowstorm, and everything is shut down, yeah, that does present some difficulties, but it also often reminds people of what matters to them and what they would rather be doing. And this is something that a great number of us have lost sight of in our current civilization. So I think there are really positive potentials, but first we have to, keep from completely wiping ourselves out.
All right, that's quite hopeful.
Yeah, hopefully.
Can you talk a little bit about society's tolerance for discomfort and how this relates to climate anxiety?
Sure. So, in general, it's the case that our civilization, and our society, our particular culture, has a very low tolerance for discomfort and a very low tolerance for ambiguity. And that tolerance for ambiguity, that's pretty common. That turns up in the majority of the population most of the time. But the tolerance for discomfort is really striking and quite ahistorical. So we really don't want to endure any kind of discomfort for any length of time. We are a society that has a real investment in painkillers, in distraction. We never want to experience boredom, so we have our phones with us at all times so that we don't have to. And who really doesn't like confronting some of the kind of existential aspects of life, old age and death. We, tend to send our old people off, right, to long-term care homes. Many people in North American society have never experienced a death. That is to say that they've maybe never seen a person who's died. That's extremely ahistorical. Most people would have had siblings die and older people die, right? Aunts, uncles, grandparents. So there's this turning away from discomfort that sort of runs through our culture in general. And you can really see it in particular because our culture has a very poorly developed sense of the value of tragedy. Other cultures understand that tragedy is something that deepens the character. It's part of life. It's an important part of life. And the tendency is to want to move towards all good times all the time in our culture, right? There is this kind of illusion of all good times all the time that gets sold to us. This next thing is going to make it so that everything is wonderful all the time. And because of all that, we tend not to want to sit with our discomfort for very long. It causes people immense difficulty because they don't have practice with it. And I think that's one of the things that causes people, I mean, it both sort of drives the environmental problem in many ways because, we keep things too hot and we have too much stuff and we, keep the lights on when we don't need to. And we otherwise, spend resources basically to deal with discomfort that we could just adjust to. But also it's the case that people really don't want to deal with the emotional discomfort that comes with confronting the possibility that when they look out the window, everything they're looking at is temporary. And that in many ways is an insight that goes back a long way, right? That's in some ways a fundamentally Buddhist insight. And so it goes back 2,500 years. But it's very difficult to get people to connect with that in our culture. A normalcy bias tends to kick in and people are like, well, this is how it is. And the myth of progress means it's going to be better in the future and bring on my, citizenship in Elon Musk's Mars colony or whatever. But instead to look at things and be like, this might be the high point of our material civilization. And it turns out that we squandered it mostly on, extremely unsustainable junk. Suburbia, the most the most egregious misallocation of resources in human history, right? Taking perfectly good farmland and building junk houses on top of it so that we wouldn't be concentrated, or, shipping endless numbers of, plastic bits of junk back and forth around the planet that break down. So, there is a real discomfort and sadness there because, in some ways we've squandered great wealth and people are not good at sitting with it. They're not good at sitting with the anxiety. They're not good at sitting with, to some extent, the shame that I think comes with that at some level. So, yeah, that's a problem. But, at some level, it's a problem that every human being faces. And so there are, in fact, long-standing sort of cultural responses and techniques to deal with that. Not least, as Buddhism points out, things like meditation, which does seem to be rising in popularity. So hopefully people can kind of adjust to it as it becomes clear that it isn't going away.
It's just fascinating. I hadn't thought about the relevance of Buddhist philosophy to this before, but now that you mention it makes sense.
Well, that the lecture that you saw,
yeah,
it's not only in your head. That's actually from a course that I teach on Buddhist psychology.
Oh. Okay.
Because it was one of the things that I wanted to point out. We spend lots of time in that course talking about what's going on inside of our heads, right? How we, are making problems where there aren't problems. But what I wanted to point out was, well, that's not the only thing that's happening, though. There are real problems. It's not just a question of meditating your way out of this. Like, there are things that need to be dealt with.
My final question, and it's really just kind of a rephrase of an earlier question, but what would you say to people experiencing climate anxiety or experiencing anxiety about their future?
So for people who are experiencing climate anxiety or who are experiencing sort of the general collapse anxiety about the future, I would say a few things. So one is, make sure that you're connecting to other people. And that can be difficult to do if other people are not seeing the same sources of anxiety as you are. And the desire to, of course, want to flood people is very strong when this comes on you. But it's important to talk to other people. It's also, I think, quite important to, if it's at all possible, to seek some professional assistance. So I myself am a psychotherapist, and this isn't just self-promotion talking. I think it's important for people to have somebody to work with when they're dealing with such strong feelings. But at the same time, dealing with this kind of thing is just plain difficult. There is no easy way to do it. There's no easy way to look around and realize that the world as we know it is dying, and that we are probably going to see it in the near future in ways that are difficult for us to imagine, real horror and real terror. That's hard. And so the thing is that in addition to sort of reaching out to people and getting that support, it's about sitting with your feelings enough so that you can internalize the truth of the situation, and then to start asking yourself the question what you can do. Because there are things that you can do. And the worst situation, that you can be in is to just feel completely powerless. You may not be able to change the situation overall, but that doesn't affect your response to it. And that's the distinction between hope and optimism. There is this line in The Lord of the Rings, right, where Frodo complains that he wishes he didn't have to deal with the whole situation, and Gandalf responds by saying, "So do all who live in such times, but it's not up to us to decide the times that we live in. It's only up to us to decide what we're going to do with the time that we're given." And that's always true. It's always been true. This is the fundamental, truth of acting in life when death is real. So, humans have been doing this for a long time. It's not new. And trying to get through to that place where you can ask yourself, okay, so let's say that things are not going the way I planned. How am I going to respond to that? And to seek what support you can. That's what I suggest to people.
Thank you so much for spending all this time with me, Anderson.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.